Hello, I'm Derek with North Little Rock's Layman Library and want to welcome you to Meet the Author. Joining us today is Dr. Samuel Taggart, author of Country Doctors of Arkansas. Dr. Taggart earned his medical degree from the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences College of Medicine and has been in practice for over 40 years. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for having me.
All right. Let me begin by just asking you, how did this book or this project begin?
In 2012, I was writing a book that was recruited by the Arkansas Department of Health to write a book about the public's health in Arkansas over the last 200 years. And the man who recruited me is Dr. Joe Bates, who is just he's a mentor of mine and a wonderful man. And we were editing the book, that book, The Public's Health. And he said, Sam, there are an awful lot of country doctors out there in the state of Arkansas who labor away in relative obscurity, known only to their patients and a few colleagues. And that started rolling around in my head. And I went home and I told my wife, and I said, we need to start interviewing some of those guys. And so this project began as an attempt to interview as many of those guys in towns of 2,500 to 5,000 as we could find. Okay. And we did. We interviewed about 60 people, 60 physicians in those towns. And the lion's share of this book, you've seen it, the lion's share of this book details these guys' life and their towns, because you can't extract them from their towns. They're very much a part of that. Mm-hmm. So I credit and by the way, the project, this is all done in the context of a 501c3 called the Arkansas Physicians Oral History Project. Any money we make off of this book goes back into the project for the next book. Okay, so that's what this is all about.
Okay, all right. Well, you sort of alluded to something that I wanted to ask. Who were these people?
Yeah, that's a real good question, and it's variable. My son is a cultural anthropologist at Virginia Tech, and he said, Dad, there are 4 things that people want to know when you're talking about their history and their culture. One is, who were they? What did they face? What tools did they have? And how did they respond? Almost all of the physicians we interviewed and the towns we went to are people from small towns. These are people who went off to medical school and made the conscious decision to return to a small town, because that's where there's one guy that's particularly interesting in the book. His name is John Hirschberger, and he lives in Nashville, Arkansas. And Nashville's a town of 2,500 people or so, kind of like Heavener. Mm-hmm. And John went to medical school thinking he was going to go back and be a family doctor in Fordyce, which is where he was from. And he got enamored of surgery. Then he got enamored of cardiovascular surgery. And he became a very successful cardiovascular surgeon. And after about 20 years, he said, this is not really what I want to do. And he moved to Nashville.
Wow.
And he's not doing he's a general surgeon, but he's a country doctor because that's part of who he is. That's part of who he is. Most of these people have some characteristics in common that are really, really important. Okay. They're really important. They engender trust. Their patients trust them to do the right thing, and they trust them to be there when they're needed. It's a really, really important thing that I had not realized how much that is a real important thing. The people in the small towns think of their doctor as one of the wisest people they've ever met. Okay? In most of the cases, that's true. Maybe not all, but in most cases, that's true. Mm-hmm. And they understand that these guys are wise and can take, and they're priests of technology. Okay? They take all of this technology out there and they interpret it in terms of these people's lives. Okay? One of the other characteristics of these people is that there are 2 half breaths that we experience in life. The very first one is a gasping half breath when we begin life. Okay? And the last, almost always, is a sigh. Okay? That last exhalation.
Okay.
Country doctors are there from that first gasping half breath to that last sigh. And that's a really important, because they become, as I said, priests of technology. They become the narrator of the family story. They become the narrator of the community story. Okay, they're almost like the play Our Town. You could easily put the doctor. You could put these country doctors. When you look at the world literature, and I have really looked at this pretty intensely. When you look at the world literature about country doctors, it is almost uniformly done in a positive sense. You almost never see the country doctor, even in the darkest Eastern European and Russian authors, the Chekhovs and the Dostoevsky, and I can't never pronounce that name right. Even those people, they portray the country doctor, the family doctor, the country doctor, in a very positive light. When you read poetry about doctors, about country doctors, it's almost always in a very positive light. They're really interesting. And those are some things that came home to me more so than I thought about long before when we did this project.
Okay. You, in your comment or in answering that question, it made me think of something that is, or at least was, a policy in the state of Oklahoma, where I'm from. Many doctors would go to the University of Oklahoma Medical School, and they wanted to practice in places like Oklahoma City or Tulsa. And so the state was doing something to the effect that they were like giving, scholarships or giving a lot of financial aid to doctors if you would go to these small rural towns to practice. Does Arkansas have any?
Yes.
Do they have?
Yes.
Could you talk about that?
Yes. There are several things that were done in the late 1940s, at the beginning of the modern country doctor movement, which the modern country doctor movement started in 1947-48, after World War II. About 2/3 of the doctors in Arkansas cared for about 1/3 of the patients, and they were in cities like Fort Smith and Fayetteville and Little Rock and Jonesboro and Texarkana. And there was a political move about to find out how do you reverse that. It was already known at that way. The way to get doctors into small towns is to recruit students from small towns. And the second thing is to train them close to where they will practice. So in the late 1940s, the state of Arkansas was getting ready to build the new medical school, which is the old medical school, which is the medical school now. And when they put a lot of money into it, they said, we want you to train doctors to go out in the country, because there weren't a lot. In the early 1950s, about 1954, they passed the People's Act, which was a rural loan forgiveness. If you, as a medical student, took out one of these rural loans, I took out one of those rural loans. If you took out this rural loan, then you practice in a small town for a year, 2, 3, 4 years. There was a certain amount of forgiveness that was being done. The other thing that was really, really, really important was in the early 1970s, we had a wonderful set of men who were at the medical center and in the university system. Tom Bruce, Winston Shorey, and I can't remember the other guy's name, but they James Dennis. They created a project called the AHEC Project, a School Without Walls, Area Health Education Centers. And what they did was they created centers in Pine Bluff, Texarkana, El Dorado, Fort Smith, Fayetteville. There's one in Jonesboro, where they would, when people would go to medical school, they would take them out and they would do their residency programs in these smaller towns, okay, and get a much broader experience. And that has resulted in a dramatic increased number of kids going into practice in smaller towns. The AHEC programs have been ultimately successful in Arkansas. So loan forgiveness, recruiting from the right place, And the AHEC programs have all been extremely good. I didn't mention Pine Bluff. Pine Bluff, the program down there is just wonderful. Mark Atwood, who runs that program down there, and he's, by the way, is in our book. When I asked him, one of the last questions I asked in these interviews was, what do you want people to remember about you when you're gone? And he said, I want people to remember that my contribution was that I spent my professional life training doctors to go back into small towns. And he's from Rising. Anyway.
In that answer, you said something that made me think of something I wanted to ask you. You used the word men. And I was just thinking, in your book, though, you bring up some women.
Right.
I don't know that they would be considered by today's standards actual medical doctors, because I don't know that they got to go to college. But how has I don't know what the word is, gender as well as race, changed for a country doctor?
Oh, it's wonderful. It's a wonderful change. When we started doing this project, when we started setting up and going out and doing the interviews, we thought we were going to be interviewing old white guys.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's all we thought we were going to do.
Uh-huh.
And what we discovered was, if you look at the 75 and above age group, it's all old white guys.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the 55 to 75 group, you'll see a lot more women and physicians of color. If you look below 55, you see an awful lot of women and physicians of color. So what we saw was in this project, and it's in the book, I mean, it's detailed in there, is what we saw was that there has been a major change in the makeup of who country doctors are.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that has to do with Title IX. We had talked about that before we went on camera. Title IX in 1972 said you could not discriminate by gender.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so when I graduated medical school in 73, there were 5 women out of 108 people in my medical school class. In 2000, 51% of a larger class, 51% of that class was female, and it continues to grow.
Mm.
So the women portion of this is a really important part of it, and it is changing the nature of the practice of medicine in country doctors and in family practice and country doctors in specific.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious about something, because when you talk about country doctors, I always think of an episode from the Waltons. You remember the TV show?
Yeah.
Okay, right. Well, when you have back in, let's say in the 30s, 40s, or even earlier, did the doctors, who were probably mostly male, did they have any problems examining a female patient? The reason I ask this is my mother was so pleased. She's from Heavener, a small town, when they got a female gynecologist.
Right.
Oh, it was such a relief. Did you ever come across any records or anything like that the nurse had to hold the stethoscope against the female? Anything like that, or any?
No,
you didn't find any problems like that.
No, not in. But now we weren't focusing on that. Okay.
Okay.
So now it might have been different had we been focusing on that. You do know that the stethoscope,
Mm-hmm.
the one that rings around the necks of all doctors,
Mm-hmm.
started for that very reason.
Oh, so they wouldn't have to touch them.
Well, in 1814, Laennec, who was a French physician, the only way he could listen to a woman's chest was to put his ear to their chest,
Mm.
and so he created a stick that had a bell on it, and that was the very first stethoscope. So yes, that's always been a problem.
Mm.
Okay, that's one of the reasons that if you look back to midwifery,
Mm-hmm.
and gynecology in the 19th century, not the 18th century, but in the 19th century, that was to a great extent more women than it was men.
Mm.
Okay, even in an area where there weren't that many women in medicine. Okay.
All right. Okay. What would you say are some of the major problems today for these rural doctors?
It's the same thing that everybody who lives in those small towns experiences. They're food deserts. They're called food deserts, where the only grocery store may be a Family Dollar store,
Okay.
and all they have is canned foods and processed foods.
Okay.
The problem is education. Many of the best and the brightest have left.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so and this sounds pejorative, but I don't mean it to sound that way, but many of the politicians, many of the schools, many of them have suffered because of it. So that's a problem for many of the physicians who practice out there.
In your book, you bring up an act. It's called the Arkansas Act 1220. Do you remember that?
You'll have to remind me what that was.
Then let's skip over that then, because you said it was Arkansas was the first state to enact it, but we'll skip over that. What about telemedicine?
Really interesting subject, fascinating subject. Telemedicine has been
Is it
around.
catching on?
Yes,
Okay.
it is. Yes, it is catching on, but it's slow.
Okay.
It's slow. But COVID just really made it catch on a lot more. Okay. Because for the safety of the patients, for the safety of the nurses, for the safety of the doctors, for everybody's safety. And many of the physicians were very reticent to do it to begin with, but they're beginning with established patients, to feel much more comfortable with it.
Okay. You bring up a lot of the history of medicine in your book, because you're talking about the history of the doctors. What kind of equipment? Was there anything that this really just intrigued you, or you just thought, I've just got to share the public with the advanced or archaic that you just thought was fascinating?
If you think about it, in the 19th century, and this is in the last fourth of the 19th century, doctors did not have needles and syringes. No needles and syringes, not just disposable ones. They just didn't have them. They were first introduced in Arkansas in the 1870s. They didn't have stethoscopes. They didn't have blood pressure cuffs. They didn't have x-ray machines because they didn't have electricity.
Whoa,
okay.
wow.
All right. They very seldom used a microscope because they didn't have a reliable light source. Okay. So all of these things came on board in the last part of the 19th century, the early part of the 20th century. Transportation was another thing that was
yes. I would have thought that when you talk about, let's say, although I didn't really ask you, it's like difficulties, is that a lot of this equipment is expensive. I remember I had a friend whose father was an optometrist, and this was like in the 1980s. She said, Derek, that machinery, just to check your eyes, I don't know if it was Bausch and Lomb or whatever, she said it costs $1 million to buy. And I would think that for the country doctor, who's maybe the only doctor, if he or she has to buy equipment like that, they would be reluctant, and they would say, hey, we got to send you to a larger city where you can use a clinic. Can you just, I know that I haven't really asked you a question, but you know what I'm alluding.
I know what you're getting at. What has happened is, if a doctor was going to set up a practice, Hiram Ward in Murfreesboro, Arkansas, set up a practice in 1952 for about $1,200. Okay.
Wow.
About $1,200. Fast forward 25 years, it was $100,000. Fast forward another 20 years, and it's dramatically increased. This has resulted in a corporatization of medicine, where instead of a single physician working by himself, or maybe two, you've got 8 or 10 working together. And then you have vertical integration with hospitals, where that equipment, where some of that equipment cost is on the larger organization. That's where groups like Our Care, Baptist Hospital, St. Vincent's, or charity hospitals, that's where they play a role in both the vertical and horizontal integration, and it reduces the cost for the guys who are out there practicing.
Have you written, what is your next book?
The next book, I just finished a book called For Every Family, a Family Doctor. It sounds like the same book, but it's not, because this is the 75th anniversary of the Arkansas Academy of Family Physicians, which I was a member of. And it's going to be primarily focused on family physicians, and it'll primarily be very promoted to them. But my wife and I, my wife is a retired ophthalmologist, we're working on a book called Against the Odds, and it's going to be Arkansas women in medicine in Arkansas before 1972. And I've spent quite a bit of research already, and it's a wonderful fun. It's great fun book. Great fun.
When do you think it will come out?
Oh, that book is going to be a year or two.
Okay,
It's good.
all
But
right.
the family practice book will be out in January.
Okay,
It'll
all
be out in
right.
January.
Dr. Taggart, if people wanted to purchase this book, how could they purchase it?
Well, I have it on my card here, but they can purchase it through the Arkansas Times Shopify site. Okay, the Arkansas Times has a site that you can go on, that people can go on, and I can leave this with y'all.
All right.
It's and you just go in there and order it.
Okay.
You go order a book and order it, and they get it from me, but mainly get it from here. That's where.
Okay.
Again, remember any profits we make from this book go back into the 501c3 for the next book.
Okay. Are you on social media?
Oh yeah, Facebook.
Okay.
I'm all over
Okay.
Facebook.
If you could let the audience know, if they wanted to contact you to ask you more information or comment, if you'd let the audience know what social media and how they could reach
Just
you.
Facebook, Sam Taggart. Okay. That's it's real easy. There aren't. I think I may be the only Sam Taggart in Arkansas. There are a lot of other Sam Taggarts. Okay, but I'm the only Sam Taggart in Arkansas, I think. Okay, but I'd be more than willing to, and I'm more than willing, because one of the things we didn't talk about is that I would like to comment on is most of the promotion I'm doing for this book has to do with honoring the people who are in the book. And so I'm going out to these towns and honoring them, and I'm just having a wonderful time doing it.
Well, you've done a great job. You really have. I enjoyed reading the
Thank you.
book. So thank you. And thank you for being here.
Yes, sir.
All right.
Well, thank
okay.
you. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. It has been a pleasure. If you're interested in reading more from Dr. Taggart, please visit us in the library or find us online at Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, or our website, nlrlibrary.org. Join us again next time and have a great day, everyone.